When we speak about vocations, we speak about the priesthood, the religious life, and marriage. We know that there is a sacrament for priests called holy orders. I might quiz you in a minute, Emmanuel. We know that there is a sacrament for matrimony, or for marriage, called holy matrimony. The question is, what is the sacrament for religious, for monks and nuns? Jared, you're hiding behind glass, so I can't call on you, but pretend I just did. What is the sacrament that religious receive? Well, some people think they receive holy orders, but that's not correct. The sacrament they receive is called baptism. Because in our baptism, we are consecrated to God. And while we might live that consecration as priests or in marriage and family, it is still a consecration to God. And some people take that so seriously, as they should. It's the higher state of life. And they make a vow to live that way perpetually, and they do so in communities because it is not good for the man or woman to be alone, and we need the support of others to live the life. And these live in monasteries, these powerhouses of prayer, which are critical to the life of the church. And while we certainly need to see more consecrated religious, so those of you who are not yet married, listen up, both men and women, all of us have to live this baptismal consecration, and most of you live it in a family, whether that be with a spouse and children or just your spouse. You live in what I will call the domestic monastery, and that's the theme I want to go with this week. I spoke about the domestic church last week, and I'm going to address it from a different perspective this week. And the first way I want to do that is through the vows that they take based on the evangelical counsels. The evangelical counsels are things which our Lord highly recommends for perfection in the Gospels, hence the word evangelical. And that while we are not commanded to do them, if we seek perfection, we should do them. And those three are poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, they're lived in a slightly different way by consecrated religious than by laity or priests necessarily, but there is still an aspect to them because our Lord preaches them that we should follow. As lived by religious, the vow of poverty is not owning anything. Whatever you have belongs to your monastery, to your order, and that's it. Everything is held in common. Now, some of them take that to the point of having, well, this very nice car that we have is not owned by any one of us, it's owned by the monastery. And that's kind of going against the spirit of poverty. But that's how it's lived in the orders. In a Christian home, we should not have an emphasis on personal possession, to live a spirit of poverty, to learn, as we should have been taught in kindergarten, to share. But there should also be a simplicity of life. Our lives, whether we are monks, nuns, priests, or laity, should not be cluttered by useless material things. And while there may be some people in this parish that this does not affect, I would put money on most of us being able to do at least a little bit of that decluttering. And I'm going to say, as a practical point, for those of you who have been around a little bit longer than others, please work on that now so that your children don't have to. I'm just asking on their behalf. The other way that this manifests in the home is in the sharing of financial abilities, such as sharing bank accounts between spouses. I mean, if you can't trust your spouse with your bank account, you probably shouldn't be getting married to them. Just saying. Chastity is a technical word which many people are confused on. Chastity does not mean the avoidance of the marital act. What it means is living that part of our being according to our stated life, which means, for those of us who are not married, total avoidance of it, and a careful guarding of our hearts regarding those we may be attracted to. But even in marriage, it is still a guarding, because just because you're married, that only means that that's one less person you have to worry about. You still have to guard against everybody, your heart against everybody else. And that when you And the third vow is obedience. Again, this is something that we're all bound to because of the fourth commandment. Ultimately, of course, it's obedience to all of the authority in our legitimate authority in our lives that come from God. In the family, that is the father. And while we've spoken at a different time, and I can do so again for those who'd like to discuss it, why that's not unfair necessarily, it is certainly emphasizes the imperative that the lady choose wisely. You young ladies in the back who are still available, keep that in mind, please. And for all children, that goes to your parents. Oh, sorry, look over here too. There's a couple over here who need to hear that. Ultimately, of course, all of this is directed towards the authority which is found in the will of God for us. The other way that I want to look at this, beyond the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, is how the consecrated religious live in monasteries. Because ultimately, as I hope you will see, especially if you're not familiar with the life of the religious, there really are complete similarities. How it's carried out may be a little bit different based on your circumstances versus that of a monk, but it's still the same thing. The first is that there has to be order, that there must be a strictly ordered life, that there is submission to authority in the monastery, that's the abbot, and there must be authority exercised in the home. But that order is also found in the schedule. It can be difficult with kids and all their different activities, which is why there shouldn't be so many, but there must be a schedule. If nothing else, going to bed on time is a discipline and a mortification which allows one to fulfill one's duties. Monks also follow a rule written by their founder, which they agreed to when they joined the monastery, and is necessary for the proper functioning of the monastery. And I think you're all very familiar with the fact that homes also have rules. They may vary from house to house, but it is necessary for them to function with rules. Prayer is, of course, also another important aspect of the life of the monastery. It fills the life of the monastery. And it's one of the ways, the most regular ways, that we live our baptismal consecration regardless of our state in life. Prayer should be regularly scheduled in the home. Now, based on everyone's schedules, when that is and how often, of course, will vary. But that should be something that's regularly scheduled. And I want to say very particularly, this communal prayer applies in almost a more particular way for those of you whose children are not at home. You should be praying with your spouses. And if your spouses are no longer with you, may they rest in peace, and make sure you're praying for them. But you might seek out other people to be praying with. But we should not have to be alone in our spiritual lives. It's one of the reasons why public prayer life in the parish is so important. But you married couples need to be spending time together in prayer. Now, we should also have time for personal prayer, because your husband, wife, even your children or your parents, aren't going to always have the same devotions that you do. And so it's not necessary for everyone to be praying exactly the same thing in the house. But when it's time, when your parents say it's time to come down and pray the rosary, don't give them grief, don't make a fuss, just come and pray like you're supposed to. And parents, please try and be sensitive to not interrupting things, plan it out. Work is also a major part of a monastery. A monastery has to survive on something, has to subsist. Very often, monasteries used to have their own lands which they would farm. These days, you can go online and order coffee from monasteries, and that's how they stay in business. Oh, and I was reminded earlier today, beer. We can thank monks for good beer. So, and I have some suggestions if you'd like. There's one in Germany that's still run by monks. That's excellent. So they sustain themselves. They do what they need to bring the income into the monastery to provide for their needs. They also obviously do what's necessary in the monastery itself. And families need to do the same thing. Obviously, in our economy, most people have jobs outside of the house. Most people don't work at home, which is very sad, but that's a subject for a different sermon. The fact is that everyone should still contribute to the maintenance and the well-being of the home itself. I told you last week that adorable story about my niece doing a whole matching thing with a silverware. I can also tell you, my nieces and nephews know where the vacuum cleaner is, they know where the brooms are, and as soon as they're able to walk, they also know where the diapers are to go get one when it's time. So they all contribute to the home. That doesn't mean they don't play, it doesn't mean that they don't recreate, but they do contribute. And speaking of recreating, that's another thing that religious do together, and which is necessary because we can't work constantly. We have to have the humility to say, I need rest on a daily basis, and especially on Sundays. God rested on the seventh day as an example to us. And again, it's an act of humility to do that. Christian families should have leisure together. But because I think a lot of parents aren't interested in playing Minecraft, obviously there needs to be some time for personal leisure as well. I can just imagine you trying to get your mother or father to play Minecraft with you, Emmanuel. But the fact is that there should at least be something that happens in the family when they're all doing something together, even if it's not everything. Just be careful of too much time alone and too much leisure, because if it especially includes electronic devices, the devil is waiting to spring that trap. Study is also a part of the life of a monastery. I've spoken about the need for study before, and so I really won't say much more, except, again, like with many things, it's communal and it's private. Obviously, we should be studying as a family, but also, because every family member is at a different level and has different needs in their study, they need to also do their own private study. And the subjects for study are principally the scriptures, the catechism, and the lives of the saints, all of which can be found in our gift shop, open after Mass. The life of the domestic monastery should also reflect the times of fasting and feasting, the days of penance and the days of liturgical celebration. We all know to celebrate birthdays and wedding anniversaries, even though the men aren't going to remember the dates all the time. We'll get back to that in just a minute. But we want to look and follow the church's calendar in the home, that we're doing penance on Friday, we're not having the best meals on Friday, that we're abstaining or doing other kinds of fasting, especially then during the seasons of Advent and Lent. But that we should also celebrate appropriately according to the liturgy. On Sundays, the Lord's Day, that we celebrate that we celebrate Christmas and Easter and Pentecost well. And, in a particular way, I want to encourage the celebration of the anniversaries of the reception of the sacraments. Jerry, do you remember what day you were baptized?
What day?
Yeah, what day? What's the anniversary of your baptism? Hey, you got a month at least. That's better than most people I've called on today.
April 1990.
But you got a year or two. Okay. It wasn't that not as long ago as I thought. Cesar, what day were you baptized? What day did I baptize you? How about that? Are you sure? Because I don't remember. Okay. Ollie? Okay, very good. So, you have homework. Baptism, June 12th. Confirmation, don't remember that one actually. Alright? Marriage anniversaries. Guys, I actually don't understand how a guy can forget. Because if nothing else, you got to deal with the wrath of your wife. So that would cause me to remember what the date was. But ordination anniversaries, maybe obviously none of you, but maybe one day some of your children. June 9th, y'all did a great job last year. Corona kind of ruined it this year, but okay. But we need to celebrate those anniversaries. Your homework is to go look them up so that you know what your anniversaries of your baptisms or your sacraments are. And the last point I want to make is on the use of space. Obviously, a monastery is an enclosed space where the life of the religious takes place. There are common spaces and personal spaces, but most of the life of a monastery takes place in the public space, and I think that's very important for families. Obviously, everyone needs a little bit of alone time, and we want to respect that, but we also, of course, want to remember that it's ideal for us to be together. Even our teenagers, who, while they need their alone time, also need to be reminded that they're still part of the family sometimes. We need holy iconography in all of our rooms, minimally a crucifix and probably an image of St. Joseph of the Sacred Heart, the patron saints of the home, for example. But some place which is set aside, which means holy, so that we can pray and focus on the prayer while we're there. Remember that we as human beings, body, soul, composites, need our senses to be fed as well, because that affects our soul, which is one of the reasons why we have so much iconography in our churches. The last point on the use of space I want to say doesn't technically apply to the home necessarily, and that is the fact that most religious are what we call cloistered, that they don't leave their monastery unless absolutely necessary for like doctor's appointments or maybe to vote. I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation with a Christian home, but I am saying that it teaches us something important, and that is that our lives should be in the home. Work is necessary, but only secondarily to support the home. School is certainly not our priority. It's important, get your education, at least something, but the schools should not own our children and therefore our family lives and our schedules like they do. The home must be the priority, and that is where everyone's hearts should be and not scattered to the four winds. Now, those who already have children or their children are older, it's a lot harder to establish that. And of course, I know for many of you this doesn't apply, but insofar as you can say anything to your children or grandchildren, it will be valuable, because we have lost in our society the value of the family, which is why I'm preaching on it like I am, because the home and the parish church are the two hubs of our lives. Everything else should be secondary, but in the lives of most Catholics, in practice, that's not the case. And so we need to have a return to that for the sake of what goes on there, and that is the formation of the souls of our spouses and our children, for those of you who are at home with your parents, of your parents, for God's greater glory and the salvation of our souls.